Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities for another one of our lively books at lunchtime. My name is Elleke Boehmer, and I'm appearing this afternoon in two guises, in two roles. Firstly, as Director of Torch and as Chair of this panel, and then I'm going to step across and put on another cloak and act as one of the panelists, one of the contributors and commentators, because world history, global history, is something that's very, very close to my domain of concerns. But first of all, I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel in my capacity as chair, and I will introduce them in the order in which we are speaking, beginning with Richard Drayton in the middle, who is the Rhodes Professor of Imperial History at KCL, King's College London. He's the author of, amongst others, Nature's Government, Science, Imperial Britain and the Improvement of the World, which won the Forkosh Prize of the American Historical Association, and also of Masks of Empire, the Material Foundations of Global History, which will be published later this year by Palgrave. From 1995 to 8, while Darby Fellow at Lincoln College, Richard was with John Darwin and Peter Carey, one of the conveners of the first seminars here at Oxford on global history. So there's a bit of a personal history there too. Second up is Hannah-Louise Clark, who's a Departmental Lecturer in Modern History here at Oxford. She studies the history of science, medicine, and empire in the Middle East and North Africa, and her work draws on a long engagement with the history and languages of that region, including extended periods of study and research in Algeria, Egypt, Lebanon, and Morocco. Then there's myself, but I won't spend too long introducing myself. As well as being Torch Director, I'm Professor of World Literature and English here in the English faculty, and my two recent books are Indian Arrivals and The Shouting in the Dark, and they both came out last year. Then the two of the four editors of the book that we're discussing today, The Prospect of Global History, are John Darwin, who is seated beside Hannah-Louise. John is Professor of Global and Imperial History here at Oxford and specialises in the history of the British Empire and of empires as a whole. And he, amongst his many books, are After Tamerlane, The Empire Project, and also Unfinished Empire, the Global Expansion of Britain, which came out in 2012. And seated right beside me here, another of the editors, and they will be responding to the panelists and our short reviews. Beside me here is James Belich, who is the Beit Professor of Imperial and Commonwealth History and the Director of the Oxford Centre for Global History. He is a New Zealand historian known for his work on the New Zealand Wars and on New Zealand history more generally. And one of his major works on the 19th century clash between Maori and Pakeha was the revisionist study, the New Zealand Wars. So it's a great pleasure to have this very distinguished panel with us of historians. It's also a great pleasure to host a book at lunchtime which is on a historical subject. I don't think, had one yet this term, so that's a great pleasure. So now I'm going to don one cloak, or put down one cloak and put on another, and step across and invite Richard to comment first. Thank you.
It's somewhat daunting to attempt even to summarize a book of the complexity of the prospect of global history in the 5 to 10 minutes I have. From the scent of incense off the coasts of Arabia Felix in Diodorus to an American minesweeper on a Philippine reef in the age of Obama, via Islamic globalization, the global shock of the Black Death, post-Enlightenment constitution making around the world, the measurement of global connection via the convergence of prices and wages, Prospect, as I shall apostrophize it, collects a system of experiments in global history, which show how old sources can be put to new transnational use, or how one might find new kinds of sources, as in Francis Robinson's mapping of Islamic cultures of storytelling. These experiments draw on the two main styles of global history, either in connective mode, examining how history is written through attention to the interactions of different places, or in comparative mode, understanding how one theatre of human experience, such as Qing China, might illuminate a history normally seen from another angle. Prospect also contains a powerful set of claims and speculations as to how global history might be done, both embedded in these experiments and more explicitly in the theoretical chapters, such as its muscular introduction, Osterhamel's essay on history and sociology, and Moore's on periodizing the global Middle Ages. On this note, consider how Bruce Maslish in 1993 had argued that while there was a world history to be pursued to the depths of time, global history was exclusively the story of the 20th century. One of the most exciting aspects of Prospect, something which is perhaps one of the distinguishing glories of the emerging Oxford School of Global History, is its insistence that medieval history is not just global history too, but is alive in the fabric of the modern. Prospect in general is an impressive showcase of the vision of the Oxford Centre of Global History and of the impact of Jamie Belich and John Darwin. I compare where you are now, when such major figures like Wickham and Purcell are excited participants in what we could call the global conversation, to what it was like in Oxford when I began my teaching career here in 1994 as a Fellow of Lincoln. I had then the pleasure of being part of the first stirrings of global history in this university, the World History Seminar, which John, Peter Carey and I ran in Trinity. And this, of course, is running. I see Patrick O'Brien in the back of the room, and I shouldn't lose the occasion to celebrate Patrick O'Brien's quite extraordinary contribution to global history in this country. First of all, in the 1990s, through the seminar he ran at the Institute of Historical Research on global history over the very long term, and then later on as being the moving spirit in the Global Economic History Network. But in terms of the Oxford enterprise, from the very beginning, it reached ambitiously back, beyond even Braudel. I remember the late Patrick Wormold offering a brilliant argument for the Saxon invasion of Britain as a genocide, dressed in a slightly grubby white suit with a red rose in his buttonhole. For this was May the 2nd, the Friday after the Labour victory of May 1997. But our seminars had the quality of a heretic's meeting in Rome's catacombs. For in the ideology and economy of the Oxford Historical School, embodied in its division of British history versus general history, which in practice meant the history of France, Germany, and Russia. What happened abroad, in particular outside Europe, was at best an object of heterodox curiosity, if not, in Trevor Roper's infamous phrase of 1965, the unedifying gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. I take this road because one of the curious silences in Prospect is any reflection on the politics of history, not just at Oxford, but more generally in the problem of global history, which of course is a cultural phenomenon which emerges in the wake of the end of the European empires and is connected to that particular cultural moment. There's not any explicit reflection on the connected problems of positionality, of the forms of intellectual path dependency which flow from the global history of power, of the inequalities of attention and research person power, of how the history of inequality is reproduced in the tools, methods, and institutions of history. Prospect is, of course, a visual metaphor, and prospects, as Capability Brown and Nietzsche knew, are expressions of power, where a hierarchy of objects is organized for and from the pleasure of a privileged gaze. You may remember the line from Greenaway's film The Draftsman's Contract. The hilltop prospect of the estate to the north of the house will be kept clear of all members of the household staff and farm servants, end quote. In this prospect of global history, Africa and Latin America are mere smudges on the landscape, while the view is dominated by Eurasia and that favored problem of 21st century global history, the divergence debate. The problem really with the divergence debate, I'm not specifically criticizing this volume, but I think it's a more general problem in the subject, is the divergence debate can quite often lead us back towards that traditional historically narcissistic question, the rise of the West, answered often per Joel Mokyr in that typical historically narcissist way because of the ways we are so special, in inverted commas. Afro-Eurasia in this volume is invoked in the introduction, and I wish I had more time to talk about the introduction, which is an extremely dense piece of theoretical work. But rather as with Marshall Hodgson's Ecumene, The Afro dimension, especially south of the Mediterranean littoral, is at best exiguous. The viewers are, except for Osterhamel, all Anglo-American. Excuse me, Jamie, for calling you Anglo-American, but de facto you can assimilated, since you are. Among whom only Purcell draws significantly on historical writing in other languages. It's very interesting that even Francis Robinson, he's citing text in translation rather than the original sources in Arabic. It is the quiet complaint of European global historians that while they read and cite all the historical literature in English, we show no similar courtesy or curiosity unless something is translated. And our Japanese and Chinese friends know that even in translation, they can scarcely hope for our attention. And how often do we even know the titles of the books that are published in English in Delhi, Johannesburg, or Port of Spain, let alone in such centres of non-Anglophone global South intellectual life as Dakar, Mexico, or Sao Paulo? These asymmetries of attention and perspective should be directly confronted, in part because they can help us towards thinking about what needs to be done, both here at Oxford, but generally for global history. At the centre of the predicament of global history is the problem of our weights and measures. Let me explain. During the 1780 to 1850 span, side by side the consolidation of genuinely global European imperial systems, complemented by the penetration of continental space by railways, machine production, and machine killing, we see the rise of the sciences of measurement, of which history was one cultural product. If the Humboldtian research program inaugurated a global program of physical measurements, exploration, and cartographic representations in space, so its parallel was the Rankian historical program, which had as its aim the constitution of a set of standard practices for measuring the past, on which a program of distributed cognition ordered research into national pasts, with politics and the life of the state at their centre as the foundation for some future universal history. The legacy of the integration of European imperial and cultural power is a structural Eurocentrism, a cognitive Eurocentrism, embedded in our methods. To give two examples, consider how Marshall Hodgson's proposition of a Sung dynasty industrial revolution, or Indian historiography's constitution of a medieval period, depend on an imported set of reference, which inherently affect, if not indeed corrupt, the enterprise of measurement, ultimately cashing all phenomena into European standards. Ideas of revolution, ideas of historical change as one-way journeys, even ideas of empire, in inverted commas, these are lenses which distort at the same time as they allow us to see. And the challenge for 21st century world historians is to constitute knowledge through a multiplicity of prospects and to find our way towards new kinds of historical weights and measures. I'm optimistic that the vitality of global history at Oxford, with its extraordinary capacities in Africa and South Asia and the Islamic world, and one must hope a commitment to building strength in Latin America and the Caribbean, that this may be the place in the UK where this challenge is fully confronted. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thanks very much for the opportunity to take part in this discussion. And like Richard's comments, I'm going to begin back with my memories of my undergraduate career here at Oxford, which was in the dark era of the 90s. And then my concerns, my comment is very much sort of directed by some of the practical and personal considerations and questions I have when doing my research. So it's very much a view from the coalface rather than the prospect from over the ha-ha. So when I was at graduate school, we had to produce a prospectus, which was a prospect of our PhD dissertation. That was something you threw to the wolves before you actually knew what you were going to write your dissertation about. So you'd have your prospect, and then you'd go off and find the archives. And then, of course, your ideas about the project would change completely. So in my own case, I went to Algerian archives, Moroccan archives, French archives, and I was only able to do that kind of work and research because I picked up languages and I'd dedicated myself to studying them along the way of further graduate work. And when I was an undergraduate at Oxford, it wasn't at all obvious to me that I would take that trajectory. It was a real surprise to me that I would become an historian of North Africa, because the horizons were rather limited, and I had some remarkable teachers, and I remember being in a conversation with one of them, and I said, oh, it would be very interesting to know what the Arabic sources are on the rise of Islam. He said, oh, well, no one in the history faculty actually speaks Arabic. You'd have to go over to Oriental Studies faculty. So there are these peculiar institutional histories, which meant that although expertise existed, I couldn't really take advantage of it, and I had to plot my own path towards the kind of research I ended up doing. So for that reason, I see a very important role for this book in inspiring our students here. And I think I can see some of mine in the audience. Because although they still work within a curriculum that is slowly changing, but is determined by national frameworks, or at least the containers for history have been British and general. They can see that there are signs that this is changing, both in the complexion of the tutors who teach them, and then in the research priorities of the university. So I see it as an important tool for them, but it also still raises some unanswered questions for me about sort of the challenges of how we teach and communicate global history to our students. So one of these is the importance of comparative history, and I very much enjoyed the rigorous attention to how one goes about comparison, and particularly the chapter on historical sociology for thinking rigorously about comparisons. Well, because here in the UK most students' reference points are British or Scottish or Welsh or English, I find it pedagogically more useful, probably essential, if impoverishing, to use, say, the British Empire as a comparison, even though I would very much like to build comparisons, say, with the Ottoman Empire. Because our students need first to understand the local context beyond Britain and Europe before comparisons with Ottomans, for example, can be successfully attempted. So I think the exciting prospect of this book is that it can tempt them in that direction, but there have to be steps, there have to be mechanisms in place in order for them to have that grounding before they can make leaps up to the global level. Another challenge I find in teaching one of the other kinds of history advocated here, which is in fact a sort of defining essence of global history, is its connective aspects. Because connectivity talk is very seductive, and I think it's very intuitive to students who are born digital, and there's more of an echo of sort of the utopia of Silicon Valley and the idea of networks, and the ideologies of free market capitalism. So they can be I find it quite easy to talk about connections. It's much harder to talk about what doesn't travel and the unevenness of connections. And I think the practitioners in this volume are not at all coy about the conditions in which connection happens. So we have references to empire as a tool for pushing constitutions globally, or war, or other inequalities of power in economics. But in one essay, a comparison is drawn between intelligence services' hunt for deterritorialized terrorism and the research interests of global historians. It's mentioned twice. And that gave me pause for thought. It made me wonder what sort of political unconscious is lurking in the minds of global historians. And the search for connectivity, much like, although people like Donald Trump might try and associate all Muslims with a kind of radical Islamofascism, to mistake that for the historical and for the daily experiences and concerns of the vast majority of people would be a mistake. So I don't think anyone here needs reminding that global history focuses our attention on phenomena that can be picked up, but they may also mislead our attention. So my questions, and as I said, they're very practical. They're very much the concerns of someone at the coalface. And so one is about primary sources. And the introduction insists that the work of comparison and connectivity needs to proceed on the basis of primary sources and empirical study. And so that's something I'm committed to myself, going to neglected archives and using unfamiliar research languages. And I was reminded, thinking about archives of a project at Cambridge led by Simon Schaffer and Sujit Sivasundaram, A World of Science, which proclaimed that it's time for the history of science to go global. There have been a lot of historians of science trying to push it in global directions for quite a long time. And they determined that the ultimate hurdle is an archival problem. And the question is, well, sort of how have historians missed these archives so long? I mean, there I found them. So, you know, why have these been left out of the picture? And not only my generation finding them, but say some of the historical actors I study. So I'm very interested in the global history of syphilis. And I looked at actors in French Empire who were obsessed with the global history of syphilis, and who scoured manuscript collections in North Africa to try and find clues as to the origins of syphilis. Was it a New World disease or was it an Old World disease? So they found Arabic manuscripts, the writings of Leo Africanus, and were even digging up bones in archaeological sites like Cherchell, looking for evidence of spirochetes burrowing into the bones to be able to prove, yes, these ancient bones show that syphilis existed in the Old World. So the sources were of interest long before I came along to look at them. But that does lead us to a focus on Europeans, and that's why I abandoned the project at PhD level, because I didn't want to be writing a history of these global historians of syphilis, as fascinating as they were. And then when I found my neglected sources and my Arabic sources, I find it difficult to engage the interest of historians of science. So historians of powerful countries in the West or East Asia don't really see how my sources relate to their concerns, which remain those of how does a particular system of knowledge become overwhelmingly powerful. So I still feel sort of, you know, I'm left in the corner. And in fact, at a History of Science Society meeting, the one panel on non-Western history was down a very long corridor in an annex. It was like the, sort of, the colonial extension. And then we had a fire alarm, so we had to actually abandon the building and in our annex and give our talk outside, which just for me sort of symbolized just how removed we were from the concerns of a wonderful organization, the History of Science Society. So this is sort of a question based on your experiences. Once we have these primary sources, if we have these stories of, for example, Frances Robinson says, astrology and folk tales, how do we make other people see their importance? Another question I have is about the relationship between, and it's related, the relationship between global history and microhistory. Whether in your own work you have you sort of have a particular view on that, because the volume, and it's perfectly right it should do so, has some contradictions. And I think it's very important that this isn't prescriptive. It actually suggests a range of methods, and it would be very constraining to suggest that global history should be done in one way, or any kind of history should be done in one way. So Nicholas Purcell says that global histories need microhistory, whereas Matt Mosk is more circumspect, and he suggests that while one can go down from the global and see it played out at the micro level, so the life of a labourer or a seminarian or a merchant, to give a few examples. He said, well, then there's a problem of scaling back up. How do we know which global framework applies? So he gives the example in the Qing Empire. How do we know that a microstory belongs to the Qing Empire and not to some other kind of macro level unit? So I'm interested to know in your own research and in your own concerns where you feel that microhistory fits in. And then a final question, and these are all interconnected, because this is a question about language and how you do global history, and Richard already raised the issue of the missing works and the missing scholarship in non-English languages. So one way of doing global history that does try and overcome linguistic issues is to do research collaborations. And I've never participated in one of these myself at a sort of an organised level, although I see the work of scholarship as always collaborative in a sense. But some of these big projects, I do have concerns about them from a professional point of view. So to give an example of a really wonderful project on comparative health histories that I was reading a job advert for recently, and it was calling for people with knowledge of Eastern European languages, who are going to be, and it's a really wonderful project, and should be quite exciting for comparing healthcare institutions and how they develop in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and Western Europe. But the positions they were advertising were to bring in speakers of Polish or Estonian, so that they could read some data, tell the principal investigator what it contained, and then disappear. So it was a fixed-term contract. They were a kind of native intermediary who'd been brought in to serve the interests of some kind of project, and then off they would go. So although I think this is really exciting to be able to offer these opportunities, I wonder what kinds of inequality might they be perpetuating in the academy. And no, it's certainly not obvious to say you should sort of follow this life path of self-denial and study of other languages. And I think there are clearly all kinds of intellectually exciting benefits to be had from collaboration. But I do wonder about what your view is on how one does global history as a collaborative endeavour. Is it something that really has to wait until one has reached a pinnacle in one's career and can sort of assemble all the resources of that career to think globally? Or is it someone that someone like myself can do in collaborations, and how can those collaborations be made fair and equal opportunities to everyone? So thank you very much.
But there are all kinds of interesting convergences, I think, between the different remarks so far and what I'm about to offer you. These are delivered from an unashamedly literary perspective. These discussions are all about the interdisciplinary, so I thought I should feel unembarrassed about bringing some world literary experience into the mix. So it's a great pleasure to offer these comments on the prospect of global history, and to be alongside folks that I've been working with and have known for over 2 decades. For years, I've been trying to persuade historians and literary critics alike to recognize my research in empire writing, in scouting as a worldwide movement, and in transnationalism as history, and not just literature, and the category of the global, as well as the cognate typologies of the comparative and the connected, as in the introduction to prospect, now allows me to do so, and allows this as an interpretive frame or methodology into the field. So it is the how of the global, as much as the subject of the global or of globalization, that delineates and animates the global historical terrain. And I'm enormously grateful to this book for several reasons, 2 in particular. First of all, its boundary-crossing energies that allow us to conceive the field, to prospect it. And secondly, for that way in which it lays out for us at least 2 handfuls, so 9 or 10 of possible approaches, both converging and diverging. This number of 9 is by no means a definitive set of approaches, but rather a representative but non-exhaustive selection of possible methodologies. These range from, for me, some of my favorites, Linda Colley's comparative focus, looking at the writing and reception of constitutions across different societies since the 18th century, through Kevin O'Rourke's large-scale transnational economic analysis, building to 1600, to Jamie Bellich's own multinational case study of the differential impacts of the Black Death on European socio-economic activity. As will be clear from my wording there, all of these approaches relate to a greater or lesser extent to those core typologies that I mentioned earlier that are discussed by the editors of the global, the comparative, and of connectedness. As with world literature studies, the challenge posed by the relatively new and yet now burgeoning field of global history is repeatedly, recursively, one of approach and method, but also position. How do we analyze a field so vast, many-centered, various, layered, and multifarious? How do our transnational, region, and world-bridging critical paradigms retain critical edge in all contexts to which they are applied? This coincides closely, I think, with what Hannah-Louise was saying towards the end of her remarks there. And as importantly, how do we apply these paradigms, these frameworks, without cultural or national bias or linguistic bias or with reduced bias, especially as we inevitably occupy a place somewhere in that world. We are culturally, socially invested somewhere. These major questions have to do both with the what of global history and with the important how. And this is why it's enormously useful that the editors plunge straight in their introduction with a properly historicizing discussion of globalization, pointing out, and I'm quoting, that this is a term that needs to be rescued from the present, salvaged for the past. To define it as always encompassing the whole planet is to mistake the current outcome for a very ancient process. Globalization, the editors as bracingly continue, refers to the formation of trans-regional entities that began many millennia ago. So there was always a scope for global history in this sense. In this, they go far further back than Chris Bailey's understanding of global connections as defining the modern world, which first began, for me anyway, as a literary scholar, to sketch the dimensions of global history as a subject and as a methodology. And here I'm thinking, for example, amongst Bailey's many works in this area of his The Birth of the Modern World, 1780 to 1914, with the subtitle Global Connections and Comparisons, those words again, connectivity and comparativity. In The Birth of the Modern World, Bailey proposed that the speeded up empire building of the end of the 18th into the 19th centuries animated and extended already existing global networks. These, for him, were expressed through three dominant registers: ideology, such as in the spread of liberal ideas; human diaspora, secondly; and thirdly, forms of bodily practice. This book thinks about ideology, certainly, as a global driver. It definitely thinks about diaspora and migration. It also thinks about trade and economic relations, but not so much about bodily practice. And this is something that we might reflect more on as we take these prospects further. Might this relative neglect of bodily perspectives be because this collection is less interested in culture than it is, for example, in socioeconomic relations? Like the prospect editors, Bailey had a leading interest in connectivity, a connectivity that goes back long before the current phase of economic liberalization and globalization. And clearly, as also for the editors here, we don't have global history without connectivity. The term global, just a couple of thoughts on that for a minute. For all its presentist problems, the editors of this book are relatively happy with the word global. For them, it's sufficiently capacious, sufficiently cross-regional. Still, even with the corroboration from Bailey, for me, it's worth pointing out that other cognate words are and have been in circulation, by way of reminder and comparison. These include world, as in Wallerstein's world systems theory, his important theory of the world as one but uneven, and of worldwide axial divisions of labor. Secondly, planetary, as in Gayatri Spivak's more holistic, culturally based perception of the interconnected globe, over and above, though not excluding, socioeconomic networks. Thirdly, the universal, as in Susan Buck-Morse's Hegel, Haiti, and Universal History, a study of transatlantic culture involved in and based on constructions of race. It would be interesting to hear what the editor's approaches to these other terms as interpretive tools might be, for though they are at pains to redefine globalization as process, they do not much defend the term itself or consider its heuristic value. And again, these questions of position. Whose globe are we referring to? Whose world is this? Is it a flat or uneven world? And such questions are closely related to investigations within certain branches of world literary study that call up important considerations of mediation and the material, of perspective and interpretive framework, of who writes, who reads, on which circuits, within which institutions. Certainly, the division of the world into areas of uneven distribution, of erratic capital flows and concentration, is more to the fore in these other global interpretations. As I mentioned world literary studies again, perhaps it's worth adding something contrastive from this field, just by way of a quick aside. Interestingly, global history has grown up with the rise and rise of world literary studies. Both are shaped and driven by globalization as a phenomenon and by new forms of global awareness. For example, Edward Said in the PMLA special issue Globalizing Literary Studies 2001 wrote, "Political and economic globalization has, since the end of the Cold War, been the enveloping context in which literary studies are undertaken." But in spite of these comparative approaches and interests in connectivity in common, one strong difference of world literary studies from global history is that the comparative study of world literature always necessarily requires some consideration of language and hence also of translation. No comparative study of genre, of rhetoric, of the flow of forms or literary forms in circulation can stand free of considerations of language and so also of translation. Translation makes comparativity possible. This is one of the central points of David Damrosch's work in this field. In world history, as the editors point out, archival research in whatever source language is fundamental to its comparative boundary crossing approaches. However, the assumption is, at least in this book, or so I'm gathering, that the current language of exchange and scholarship will be English, or possibly another world language, but I think predominantly English. These comparative approaches, at least in this book, are enabled by English, by Globish, if you like, global English. In world literary studies, assumptions around accessibility are not perhaps made with the same kind of confidence and boldness. I say boldness, and in closing, this is the word that I kept coming back to in trying to encapsulate the contribution that this book so valuably makes and what I most responded to in it. I think Richard's kind of cognate word for boldness was muscularity. The boldness, the confidence, the muscularity of the proposed typologies, of the division of the world and of world history into such broad categories, very confident categories as West Eurasian, Sino-Indian, and the great divergences. The boldness and confidence of seeing the global as a range of strong possibilities and not so much difficult challenges, and the future for global history, as John Darwin writes in his afterword, as bright. There's something sweeping and omniscient in these formulations, through which it is assumed the proliferation of data and biota can be processed. There's also something, dare I say, I must say, and I promise the editor, I try to stir things up a little bit, there is something adventurously masculine about these approaches. And note that I do not say masculist, I say masculine, by which I don't mean that the approaches are unitary or monolithic, and I don't mean that this book is not interested in nuance and ambivalence, because it is. And I'm also not referring to the fact that that most of the contributors are of the male gender. There are actually any number of different ways into the field that are offered in this prospecting book. But what I'm trying to point out, as I say, by way of closing, in saying that this book is bold and muscular and masculine, is that there is some underlying perception here, possibly not articulated in so many words, that global history may require a set of qualities that till very recently have been gender tagged male. And moreover, that the historical actors, like the historical actors in focus who are looked at by this study, are more likely to be male than female. The sailors, traders, military leaders, voyagers that are of interest in these different chapters. So I'm going to close then with a question. What might a more feminist global history look like? Thank you.
No. Thank you very much for three delightfully elegant, positive, yet provocative pieces. We really appreciate this opportunity, and thanks to you all for putting the effort in. The questions that occur to me as coming out, I'll take only one from each of you. Structural Eurocentrism from Richard, I think, is a very telling point. We have inherited a profession that contains quite a lot of hardwired Eurocentrism, quite a lot of hardwired European measurements, and so on. There's a difficulty there. I think globalizing is a solution to that rather than a perpetuation of it, even though we are actually stabbing the horse we're riding. Now, I'll try to address Hannah's, I think, very appropriate focus on the relationship between the global and the local, and Elleke's necessary point about the gendering of the global project through a hypothesis which appears briefly in my article in the book on the Black Death. The hypothesis is about crew culture, my term, which I first used in '96. What happens after the Black Death is that those regions producing grain cease producing it and import their grain from more fertile regions. When their population recovers to pre-plague levels, which is about 1450, 1500, their local economies have restructured away from grain towards such things as pastoral farming, which require less labour, and which often require female and children's labour. They then develop a surplus of disposable males, crew. So after 1450, 1500, in Europe and probably, though not certainly, in the Middle East and North Africa and perhaps elsewhere, you have the region, the macro region is pocked with crew-producing localities. They are similar across national boundaries, and they aren't very concerned about national boundaries. The archetypal land variant is the Swiss, who cease struggling to produce grain in the high Alps and take up mercenary activities. And we all know that in the 15th, 16th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, the Swiss exported literally millions of men, 1.2 million in fact, two-thirds of whom did not return. In terms of maritime crew regions, you have southern Scandinavia, southern Norway, crewing the Dutch fleet. You have Cornwall, the west country of England. You have parts of Scotland. You have parts of East Anglia, sometimes very small parts. One village is a crew village, its next door neighbour is not. You have Brittany, you have the Basque country, you have northern Portugal, you have the Greek islands, and so on. These are the regions that produce the 9 million crewmen that go out as part of the expansion of West Eurasia. Now, Elleke, there's a mirror image of this. In each of those crew villages, you have a socio-economy that is unusually woman-led because the men are away. You can tell a crew village this way, and this is where the local and the global come together. You walk into the cemetery and you count the number of dead women, which should be about double the number of dead men, because the men have died overseas. There's the local, there's the global, there's the gender. Thanks very much.
Let me just take up 3 or 4 points, and then I hope perhaps there'll be contributions from the floor, because I think it'd be very interesting to hear from the wider audience. Richard, of course, does make a very important point about positionality. I suppose in the long term, or even in the medium term, the answer has to come from the emergence of, historiographical schools in other parts of the world who will expressly challenge Western or Eurocentric viewpoints. What can we do to encourage that? I suppose that really falls back upon providing events or conferences where we can hope perhaps to stimulate this kind of reaction, this kind of interest amongst historians of worlds or parts of the world beyond the West, beyond Europe. But it does seem to me that is ultimately the only way in which the real challenge to this Eurocentric positionality can be sustained, apart, in fact, of course, from our own attempts to escape from it in one way or another. Hannah raised a very important point, I thought, about how we actually teach global history. As many, or some of you anyway, who've had experience of this will know, here, and I think elsewhere, it really depends upon trying to ride two horses at the same time. One is to deal with issues which one might believe encourage comparison across a very wide range of regions, different parts of the world, universal themes or universal experience. But at the same time, I think it is important, especially for those coming new to the subject, to feel in some way anchored in particular localities, to learn the very distinctive historiography, whether it's of China or South Asia or Southeast Asia, and so on, so that at least they understand how it is to look at the world other than through what is still predominantly a European historiography. Again, that requires the challenge, I think, to be met to actually teach Southeast Asian history, as it were, in a way which is not too strongly Eurocentric. These are real challenges, I think, which we confront, and I think which the editors and contributors to this volume are all aware of. But escaping from them, I think, is harder, perhaps, than describing them. Thirdly, I think picking up on a wider point about globality and microhistory, how does one find a space in which it's possible to write about global history without, as it were, becoming too generalized, too, you might say, too detached from any sort of real world in which real archives, real people, real individuals can play their role? I think it is important to try and identify such places. My own solution to that problem is to really to concentrate on examining the role of port cities, where you do see an assemblage of multiple interests, multiple communities, actually multiple languages, because these are often places that develop their own pidgins, and to try and work out there, if you like, how the different connections, both internal, external, long distance, short distance, and how different sorts of activity, whether it's philanthropic, educational, as well as purely commercial or political, how these are brought together and how they are connected, as often they are in port cities, upwards and downwards to different scales of global connection. Finally, on bodily practices or indeed on masculinity, yes, I suppose all we can say here, Elleke, is not perhaps mea culpa, but whatever the plural of that should be, or there's a Latin scholar in the room. It is something which clearly is of great importance and significance. I suppose in a way, ultimately, the chapters in our book were put together in that pragmatic way from those who contributed to our original conference, but perhaps we should have thought in more physical terms than we did. Thank you.